Thank you to everyone for attending, those in person and those watching on the live stream. Welcome to the NYU Law Forum. The event is also co-sponsored by the Tax Law Center at NYU. My name is David Kamen. I'm the Charles L. Dennison Professor of Law, and along with Lily Batchelder, co-faculty director of the Tax Law Center at NYU. And over to you, Lily.
And I am Lily Batchelder. I'm the Robert C. Professor of Law and also co-faculty director of the Tax Law Center. So today we're here to discuss the dramatic changes that are happening to the administrative state along a number of different dimensions under this administration and also as part of the efforts of the Department of Governmental Efficiency, or DOGE specifically. Agencies, as I'm sure you have all read, have been directed to close or curtail operations, to lay off very large portions of their workforce, irrespective of the level of congressional appropriations. And then taxpayer and other personally identifiable information that was previously available to only a small group of civil servants in very tightly controlled environments is now being much more widely viewed or requested by political appointees. There's also reports of efforts to share such data more broadly across agencies, despite IRS lawyers reportedly expressing concerns that doing so is unlawful. So advocates of these changes argue that they're justified by problems like fraudulent payments, antiquated IT systems, poor customer service, and mounting budget deficits. And our topic today is therefore, what is the likely impact of these actions on waste, fraud, and abuse, on deficits, on services? What are some of the risks, and how might litigation shape the outcomes, including what are the long-term impacts likely to be? So we're structuring this very loosely as a conversation with two extraordinarily distinguished public servants. David and I will be acting as moderators and chiming in ourselves. So first, I'm delighted to welcome to the law school Wally Adeyemo, who served as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury and essentially as the COO for the Treasury Department during the Biden administration. He also has served in a number of other roles at the Treasury Department, at the National Economic Council, and at the National Security Council. He does have to leave at 2 p.m., so do not treat that as signifying anything, but we're really glad that you could join us today, Wally. And I'm also delighted to welcome Shalonda Young, who has served as the Director of the Office of Management and Budget and a cabinet member in the Biden administration. She served for 15 years on the House Appropriations Committee, rising to the position of Staff Director. And we're very fortunate to have her here on an ongoing basis as a distinguished scholar in residence at the law school. So with that, maybe I will turn it over to David.
Great. So, Shalonda, I think I'm going to first to kick off by turning it over to you. And as I do, on the one hand, efforts to centralize control in the White House, push agencies and career staff to adopt administration policy priorities, and even to root out government waste are nothing new. Office of Management and Budget, where you were director, in fact, that's sort of what it's kind of meant to do, is centralize. There's the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs there, where, of course, our colleague Ricky Revesz was head, something similar. But I think it's also fair to say that DOGE, as it appears to now have been operating, is something a revolution in the administrative state. So as you look at the reported and now evident shutdowns in agencies, curtailment of operations, apparently directed by DOGE, what do you see as the impacts? And then how would you compare that to the previous way business was done, both in your role as OMB director and as previously staff director on the Appropriations Committee?
This 2 months, has it been 2, 3? I don't know, it feels like 5 years. Yeah. Someone asked me a similar question recently, and I went, yeah, we all do stuff when we come in. You put freezes on senior level positions while you assess when you come in. As the head of an agency, you want to know what your budget situation is. You want to know who the staff is, who the players are. So you do go, let's hold up a second, give us a minute to figure out what's happening. You do look for people who burrowed in. That's normal too. When I was on the Hill, if a Democratic White House was coming in, we would flag like, hey guys, that person was a Republican appointee before you got here. You better do something about that. So that's not abnormal. The scale, the scope of what we're seeing, there's nothing comparable. I think I'm midlife. I think if you take the position of multiplying your age times 2, I think I'm about midlife. So I don't know every administration that has come before, but I've been in DC over 2 decades. Nothing even compares to this. You saw in Nixon a lot of the impoundment activity, which is why we have the Impoundment and Control Act, thanks to President Nixon. But the scale we're seeing, the firings, the administrative leaves, the targeting of certain programs like DEI initiatives. There was one woman on NPR, she's like, I did DEI like 5 years ago. I mean, these are word searches. There have been grants targeted, transgender mice, it was like trans eugenic, it was like a scientific word. Some kid is like typing in trans and seeing what pops up. So this is like, let me do a bunch of stuff. If I get some phone calls that maybe I was wrong, I will try to correct. And it was sad, like we listened to what was happening during the campaign, what we're seeing in tariffs, what we're seeing in firings. The guy who took my job, he had it before I had it, and now he's back there. He used phraseology like, we're going to torture or torment the federal workforce. I mean, they didn't lie. I think many people thought you'd see something akin to the first administration where you saw a lot of still barriers around, it had some norms or at least law following around some of the actions. And they put a lot of their budget cuts in the budget, and bipartisan Congresses turned them down. But now they have a strategy, they're just not going to ask Congress, they're going to do it themselves. You don't like it, you think it's illegal, sue. Maybe you'll win a few years from now. So that's about it. It's bad. It's bad. It's pretty bad. And I'm an optimist.
So I wanted to focus a little bit on the IRS and maybe just first to table set before I pose some questions to Wally. This administration is reportedly planning to cut 25% or more of the IRS workforce. The IRS leadership has experienced a level of turmoil that I don't think you can just say is unprecedented. It's sort of not even ever been close to have happened. So the Senate confirmed commissioner, who ordinarily has a 5-year term and continues in the role over different administrations, resigned at the beginning of the year. The following acting commissioner, who had been at the IRS for 38 years, resigned at the end of February. In the past month, the acting chief counsel, who was also long-term career staff, was removed from his role. The chief of tax compliance, chief transformation and strategy officer, chief implementation officer, chief human capital officer were all asked to leave or resign. Then last night, the new acting commissioner, Melanie Krause, who was also on career staff and had been picked by this administration, as had the previous acting commissioner, announced, or it was reported that she will be leaving by the end of the month. And we also found out that the CFO, the chief privacy officer, and the chief risk officer are resigning, and we're hearing that many others are exploring options. It's also been reported that all of the IT modernization projects that were underway at the start of the year have been canceled. So now I get to Wally. You were really deeply involved in efforts to modernize the IRS, including through long-term funding that the IRS received as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm wondering if you can describe some of the strides that were being made, what kind of unexpected challenges you faced, and also what impact you think these cuts and leadership changes will have.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with all of you. And I think we're focused on the IRS not just because we're at a law school, but because the IRS is the way we fund our government. 96% of the money that comes into the United States government comes in through the IRS. The IRS takes in not billions, but trillions of dollars each year on behalf of the United States of America. And part of the goal is to do that in a way that allows us to make sure that we can fund all the things that the government funds, from Social Security to education. And in addition to doing this, the IRS also provides a great deal of benefits. The ITC, the child tax credit, all work through the Internal Revenue Service, and it's the institution that touches the most Americans every year. And Lily talked about these leadership changes, and you usually don't do leadership changes at the most difficult time for an organization. And all of you know what happens April 15th. That's when taxes are due. So at a moment when we're trying to collect revenues for the year, you have a bunch of tumult that's happening at the IRS, which makes it harder for the talented men and women there to do their job. And I think starting with leadership matters. And when we came in at the Biden administration, and this happened in the Obama administration and happened in the Trump administration, we kept the IRS commissioner who was there, who had been appointed by President Trump. Chuck Reddick worked with all of us for a number of years, and the reason we did that was because we wanted to make sure that an institution that had a long-standing role in America had steady leadership. Our expectation was that was what would happen in the Trump administration, but it hasn't. I think it has mattered. Fundamentally, one of the things that happened during the first Trump administration was they came up with a modernization plan on how to modernize the IRS, but they never got the money to do it. When President Biden pushed to get the IRA passed, one of the things they got as part of that was $80 billion to modernize the IRS. And when we developed the implementation plan, 70% of the things that were in our implementation plan came from the implementation plan that the Trump administration had designed. We were implementing those things not because they were Republican ideas or Democratic ideas, it was because they were good ideas. They were going to make the IRS a better place, and they were focused on doing two things. One was improving customer service. When we arrived at the IRS, it was during the pandemic, the IRS was answering 13% of phone calls that people made. I think that's an F- when it comes to a grade. By the time we left, the IRS was close to answering 90% of calls because of the investments that we'd made, both not just in more people on the phone lines, but using technology. And when you think about the IRS's systems, you know they're antiquated, but I think it's important to recognize how antiquated they are. The IRS's mainframe was built in the 1960s and hadn't been updated since. That's before the ATM machine. That's before the personal computer. That's before we sent a man to space, was when that system was last upgraded. And we finally had the money to do that, and we were investing the money in upgrading that because it was going to improve customer service, but it was also going to improve our ability to collect revenue. And when we think about DOGE, one of the things that they say DOGE is focused on is how do we cut our debt and deficit? And one of the most important ways we can cut our debt and deficit is collecting the money through the IRS that it's already owed. Today, we have a tax gap, and that's the gap between taxes owed and taxes collected, of about $600 billion a year. That means that if we collected even, let's say, 10% of that $600 billion over 10 years, that is $600 billion that's going towards reducing our long-term deficit. And that was one of our aims. And what we were doing was using technology and using those resources to hire more people to help us do that. All of that work has largely been stopped now by this administration, and firing people sets us back from the ability to do that work because it's not just technology. Ultimately, if you are a wealthy person who's trying to cheat the tax system, you have the ability to hire more accountants and more lawyers than the IRS does, given their lack of staffing. So fundamentally, one of the things that Trump won and the Biden administration did was develop a modernization plan that was going to address these challenges. And unfortunately, the DOGE efforts have left us in a place where customer service is going to suffer, and ultimately, the United States of America is going to collect less revenue to pay for all the things that are important to the American people.
So, Lily, building off of what Wally just said about the importance of the IRS, and now I'm going to ask you a question despite being a moderator. Well, switching roles for a moment. One of the things on which DOGE has been focused is government data. And perhaps the place they have been most focused on it, maybe second only to Treasury payment systems, is IRS data, taxpayer data. Now, on the one hand, I can remember times of frustration in the administration when we would ask ourselves, could we administer X program better if we could actually get access to taxpayer data, data the government already has? On the other hand, there are a set of real concerns around privacy and laws that govern the privacy of taxpayer information. What do you think is the right balance, and what are the problems from your perspective of the ways that DOJ and the Trump administration more broadly has approached the issue of taxpayer data and privacy?
So I think it might first be helpful to ground the discussion in current events, which are rapidly changing. So even since last Friday, so many things have happened in that space. And there's sort of two different strands of what DOJ and the administration are trying to do with taxpayer data. One is sharing data with ICE and DHS. So on Monday, Secretary Bessent and DHS Secretary Noem signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, to share tax information on undocumented immigrants who have final removal orders. And ICE would send the names and addresses of those people to the IRS to confirm. This MOU was reportedly signed by the secretaries and not by IRS because nobody at the IRS saw the final version, which may explain a lot of the resignations that we saw yesterday. The privacy of taxpayer data is protected by law. There are civil and criminal penalties for sharing taxpayer information or even viewing it, unless you fall into very strict enumerated exceptions in the law. And there's none for immigration enforcement. There is one for criminal investigations, but there are a lot of legal concerns about sharing data with ICE under that exception that the agreement doesn't address or resolve. And there's also real potential defects to the data. So no MOU can absolve IRS officials from the responsibility to follow these laws. The second strand is what I'm going to call the hackathon. So Wired magazine reported that DOJ is planning or has had a hackathon at the IRS, potentially with the software company Palantir, to create a mega API at the IRS. So the data at the IRS is currently siloed in lots of different databases and software systems, and accessing this data requires special permissions, and workers are typically granted access only on a need-to-know basis on a very limited portion of the data. So the idea of a mega API is to create a bridge between all of these systems so they talk to each other, and that would create a read center of all the IRS systems. Reportedly, they're trying to rip up the system and create this new API within 30 days. So there's a lot of potential risks to this before I get to the areas where one could reasonably think that more data sharing would be beneficial. And I think this speaks to, as Shalonda was saying at the outset, there's, some things are not unusual, but the scale of this is extraordinary. So some of the potential risks are large share violations to taxpayer rights, whether they're civil liberties, freedoms, privacy. IRS officials have raised very serious legal concerns with the sharing with DHS, and then broader sharing among agencies, whether through this mega API or other reporting, could raise huge potential for privacy right violations. There is a real risk of data errors and identifying the wrong individual. So false positives in the ICE information. We've already seen in some of the other non-tax situations where a Maryland father was deported to a Salvadoran prison due to administrative error. There was a 60 Minutes investigation of being unable to locate the criminal records of 75% of the people who were deported. And so the law says that, and IRS procedures, that you can only allow information sharing for criminal investigations if you are certain that it pertains to the taxpayer. So you're certain that it's the right taxpayer. And then those risks multiply if no one is monitoring whether it is the right taxpayer and whether this information is being used for the right purpose as opposed to pretextual for something else. And so the fact that the chief privacy officer resigned yesterday does not bode well for that. There are also major budgetary effects. So a lot of people aren't aware that undocumented immigrants pay a huge amount of taxes every year, estimated 60 to or so billion to the federal government and another almost 40 to state and local governments. And the Yale Budget Lab has estimated that this agreement could cost over $300 billion over 10 years. So this is not good for deficit reduction if that's the goal. There's the risk of inadvertent breach of taxpayer data. So this hackathon, the mass firings of IT workers and mass layoffs in general create real risk just of an inadvertent breach. And IRS data isn't just the data on the 1040. So people sometimes bring up to me, well, other countries actually require disclosure of taxpayer data. And we're not talking just about the front of your 1040 or the net amount of tax that someone pays, which may feel unusual to disclose that, but other countries do. But IRS data is not just that, but all the information reporting that the government has on you. So that includes your social security number, all your employment data, income from your accounts and that account information, certain transactions. So this could certainly be used by nefarious actors to try to break bank security protocols, steal assets, steal your identity, target vulnerable seniors for scams. And then there's also the risk of using this data to advance private purposes. So the Wired reports that this mega API could potentially allow someone to access all of the IRS data and export it because it would all be in one place on the cloud. So this is a very long preamble to getting to David's actual question, which is, isn't it good to share more data? Wouldn't it be useful for program administration? And there are certainly cases that I would agree that maybe we should revisit the law that governs data sharing and think of some narrow cases where some more information sharing between agencies might help with program administration. But there are legal guardrails, and it needs to be done within that. And then it is just as important to have the procedural and operational guardrails. So you need staff who have real authority and are unbiased to make sure that people are only accessing this data for legally permitted purposes. There's not phishing expeditions. You need to limit access to a need-to-know basis. So Danny Werfel, who was the most recent confirmed IRS commissioner, analogized to safety deposit boxes. And a bank would never say, okay, you need to get something out of a safety deposit box. Here's the master key to all of them. They would only give the key to the thing that the staff member specifically needed access to. And that's how the IRS operates. But if you start giving the master key to a whole bunch of people, you just exponentially increase the risks. People also need to be trained on properly accessing and securing the data. And then in terms of research, there's also a lot of valid and interesting research questions that can be pursued by using tax data and then publishing on an anonymized basis the results. But that's something that Treasury and IRS are very careful about. There's a disclosure budget, which is even if each individual paper is anonymized, sometimes you could piece together taxpayer's identity if you had enough papers, and they keep track of that. So there's just all of these internal guardrails that I think are important, even when it has a real legitimate policy interest. But I am interested, Wally, in your perspective on this, including the IT function overall, because you were so involved in efforts to modernize that.
Yeah, and I think that a key message is that there are legitimate reasons that data sharing can be helpful, but we have to do it with the appropriate guardrails to protect people's information. And we tried to expand data sharing, and it took a long time, and it was hard, and it should be, because ultimately this is the personal information of the American people, and we need to safeguard it. But the thing that I was the most worried about was cybersecurity risk. And during my time at Treasury, the number of attacks from foreign actors and just criminals who were trying to get access to data in the IRS system increased disproportionately. So the thing that I worry about is that if you're allowing a number of people who may not have security clearances, who have never really dealt with government information, to have access to the source code and to the systems at the IRS, you put those systems at higher risk of being sabotaged or being taken advantage of by cyber criminals. And it's one of the things we guarded against when we were at Treasury, and we were focused on like a laser. And my hope is that they follow the appropriate guardrails to make sure that they don't inadvertently allow state actors or cyber criminals to get access to information that they can either use to enrich themselves or to put at risk a system that's critical, again, to raising revenues for the entire country. The thing that I think we have to remember is that in Trump 1, they did a number of things to develop a modernization plan, to think about cybersecurity, and those were things that we continued into the Biden administration. And the hope is that they remember what they did then, and they implement many of those things, because the risk of cybersecurity breaches is higher today than it was when I left, and it's going to continue to grow.
So, David, I want to shift to asking you a question, despite being a co-moderator. So the Trump administration has claimed these very vast powers not to spend, and this is reflected in the layoffs, 50% in the Department of Education, 25% at IRS, many essentially trying to disband USAID and CFPB, and a lot of grants not going out the door. Can you give us a sense of whether this is legal and how actions like these are likely to play out in courts? Who has, the standing and power to bring in action, what doctrines they're going to rely on, and how you think those may come out?
Sure. So I'm in my answer, I'm actually then going to pose a question to Shalonda and Wally because I'm going to transition it away from the courts and more towards Congress. But to briefly say on the issue of impoundment, let us just say there's constitutional provisions, the spending clause and the appropriations clause, which Shalonda will be quite more than a little familiar with as a former appropriations staff director. There are statutory restrictions on the executive in the form of the Impoundment Control Act. There are statements from certain key justices in their former lives, and here to quote from then Judge Kavanaugh, "A president sometimes has policy reasons for wanting to spend less than the full amount appropriated by Congress for a particular project or program. But in those circumstances, even the president does not have unilateral authority to refuse to spend the funds. Instead, the president must propose the rescission of funds, and Congress then may decide whether to approve a rescission bill." And there is a similar quote from John Roberts in his role as Associate White House Counsel in the Reagan administration in a memo he wrote. All of which is to say that if there is a clean tee-up, and that may be a question, of the issue to the Supreme Court, it seems possible that the Supreme Court would push back on some of the claimed powers that the Trump administration now seems to be saying they have. But now I want to sort of, because obviously one forum is the courts, but one way that this could be brought to a quick end, though there's no evidence that is happening in the past would have been, is Congress. And, I remember, Shalonda, you were in my LRS class and you were describing how at the Appropriations Committee you would even write in things that you knew, were not enforceable in court because there'd be CHATA violations. For those of you who can then look it up in your LRS outline. But nonetheless, the agencies would kind of do it because they wouldn't want to get you angry. And I'm sure, Wally, as Deputy Secretary, you received your share of angry calls from chairmen and so on that then sort of would cause you to maybe redirect a bit. So how do you think DOJ's claimed powers affect Congress? What do you see as in terms of any congressional response? And then how does it affect future negotiations in Congress, including on an appropriations bill that will have to get negotiated for the upcoming fiscal year?
So the thing I weep about most at night is Congress. Look, if we didn't have the system we have, it is not unusual to think a human being is let me grab all the power that I think I can get and use it and keep pressing until someone tells me no. I think the extraordinary thing we're seeing is a Congress, when I got there, used to trumpet, Republican members, got David Dreyer from California, one of the smartest members I've ever met, and his party was stupid for not making him speaker, would go around and was we're not equal. We were the first in the Constitution. And Donald Trump does not surprise me. This Congress surprises me in its lack of ability to push back through fear and through this type of allegiance that is quite scary in our system of government. You even see today, it's not just on spending. The budget reconciliation, like whether they cut Medicaid or gut Medicaid for tax cuts, they have a big vote on that today. Guess what they snuck in? They don't want their members who get antsy about tariffs to do anything about it. They added an unrelated tariff direction that basically says members can't bring up bills to stop these tariff actions through September 30th. So throughout every action where we see this unprecedented level of executive power grab, a Congress who's not just like quiet. You have a leadership of Congress who is actively pushing back even against their own rank and file members who are starting to get incredibly uncomfortable with what they see. And that's the part we're gonna have to figure out as a country pretty damn quickly. Because it was not meant to be this way. I truly think this administration thought there would be a divided Congress and came up with strategies in which to just roll over if Democrats won the House. Otherwise, you'd think that there would be some at least illusion of talking to a Congress who is led by your own party. They're not even doing that. So this is I'm not surprised by the administration as much as I'm surprised by and frankly terrified by a legislative branch who has just refused to exercise its spending power, exercise its power in, setting tariffs, and we're relying on the judiciary to keep this country intact as much as possible. Again, I'm an optimist, and I'm sitting here like looking for the positive to tell you, but even if the political system, you're starting to see some cracks with some Republican senators voting on the tariff side. You see Susan Collins, who's the Republican chair of the Appropriations Committee, signing a letter complaining about some of the policies at OMB. Because one of the things my old agency has decided to do is like ignore the law that says you have to put some of their actions that are central to governing the government, the bureaucracy, these little things called apportionments. They're incredibly powerful. That is how OMB and White Houses run agencies. They were always secret until 2022 when Congress was like, you need to put them online. When Trump withheld Ukraine money, it turns out, had we seen that apportionment, we would have known something terrible was happening. So Congress reacted in a bipartisan manner and told my agency when I was head, you need to put these online. This administration has said, no, thank you. And it's illegal. But we see this throughout every turn. You're like, well, what, everyone's looking for that thing that's gonna wake Congress up. Tariffs feels like the thing that might do it. What I think is happening on spending, honestly, I think Republican members are calling the White House, getting some of the most egregious cuts fixed in their districts or states. So they're being made halfway whole in order to hold the line.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the two places that we're talking about spending and tariffs are powers the Constitution gave to Congress, not to the presidency. And in some ways, Congress, especially when it comes to tariffs, has delegated some of that authority to the administration. But fundamentally, they owe it to themselves to hold the executive accountable for the way in which they use those delegated responsibilities. And in addition to legislation, they also have the ability to call people up. And the thing I never wanted to do was to have an appropriator call me up to come testify or talk about this project that they cared deeply about. And I think even if you're not going to be able to pass legislation, I'm interested in whether Congress will start calling hearings on these issues, especially tariffs, as they hit their communities, and also spending. Because ultimately, we're here at a university, and some of the funding to things like NIH matter to all universities, but they matter to universities are all over the country. They're in red districts, they're in blue districts, and for example, the University of Alabama, huge recipient of federal funding. To Shalanda's point, I do think that there have been calls by some members to try and deal with some of the egregious funding in their districts, but it's impossible to take that one-off approach and also be able to run an entire country. So I think the hardest part has been watching Congress in lots of ways abdicate their responsibility to provide oversight over the executive branch.
But David, if you're going to go back to the legal question, you see some of these cases and you question like how Kavanaugh can say that, but then vote with the minority. But in listening to you in your class, you know, if the courts don't want to address this, you see, you know, they may have thrown something out because it wasn't filed in the right court or someone didn't have standing. So the question, a lot of us who are following this is, can the right case, can the cleanest case get to the courts, and we have a clear answer. Well, we think we know the clear answer here on impoundment. But these cases are all very different. The way appropriations law, spending bills are written each thing is written differently. So to tee this up is not a simple thing.
Yeah, and to your point, Shalonda, the recent case that the Supreme Court effectively kicked, they did on a apparent basis that it was filed in a federal district court rather than the federal claims court. But that just illustrates that it may take some time for the correct case that they decide to take to actually get teed up. But if Congress stands silent, that could be a while. So I think we also, Lily, wanted to then pivot to a related issue of fiscal capacity. Because DOGE says, and like part of the whole goal they say, is increasing the government's fiscal capacity. And to be clear, when the Biden administration left, government was probably still on what some people would say was an unsustainable fiscal trajectory. And some adjustments probably did need to get made. How would you evaluate? I happen to have views about what adjustments, but I won't go there. I could go on for a while. How would you evaluate DOGE and the government's fiscal capacity, since that is at least one of their stated goals?
It's a joke. You can't, the same day we were talking about this, tee up a tax bill in Congress that potentially starves the government of over $5 trillion. Some estimates, you multiply out, over 30 years, we double the level of national debt we're currently sitting at, which a lot of us think is unsustainable. It's a joke. You can't say your stated goal is to fix the fiscal path while also doing this as a sleight of hand. Also, if you care about waste, fraud, and abuse, you don't fire 17 IGs. Their job is to root out fraud, waste, and abuse. So, people have to ask these questions. I'm doing this for what? And the other actions just don't, they just don't hold weight to the second part of that sentence, which should be for the American people, to put us on a better fiscal path. These other things don't align with that. I think, I go back to the Congress thing. Some of the protections around IRS data, those laws are when Congress worked together and set those policies and those exemptions clearly. If we want to get on a better fiscal path, we kind of have to both parties have to sit down and pass a bill, work in a bipartisan way. And this administrative action we're seeing through DOGE, where one party or one part of one party, the administration, is doing things without the consent, without the passage of laws in Congress, it's not going to stand. And you see things contrary to that happening, like in the budget reconciliation process and like in the firing of staff who actually were contributing towards getting our fiscal house in order.
So I think the place you start is the lowest hanging fruit. And I think the Trump 1 administration at Treasury and the Biden administration agreed on what the lowest hanging fruit was, which is just collecting the taxes from people who owe it to the government. And how do we implement a plan to improve the IRS's ability to collect mostly from the wealthiest Americans who have found ways to skip out on paying taxes? The challenge with what DOGE is doing now is they're taking away the things that we've been implementing since Trump won that allow us to be able to do that. I think that everyone agrees that we need to get on a more sustainable fiscal trajectory. Democrats have proposed a number of revenue increases, and I could agree to a set of cuts to federal spending also that may make sense. But the way you do that is, to Shalanda's point, sitting down and talking about it in a bipartisan fashion, because that's the way you sustainably come up with a plan that will last over the long term. What's happening now does not appear to be that. The DOGE's efforts are not in some ways improving our ability to collect more revenue. And Congress is not in a bipartisan fashion talking about what we can do to try and improve our fiscal trajectory, which I think is what concerns me and frankly will concern markets as well as they move forward with reconciliation.
I would just add to that, looking at the IRS specifically, the cuts to the IRS budget and the layoffs will really dramatically reduce revenues as well, so are certainly not helping with deficits. And Congress has already rescinded part of the IRA funding for the IRS and is extremely likely to rescind the rest, which will cost about $640 billion in foregone revenue. And then the proposed cuts to IRS staff, by some estimates, could cost up to $2.4 trillion over 10 years. So that is certainly not a way to fund the government. So I wanted to turn a little to both of your experience in times that we're operating more according to the way you think that they might be should be operating. And so if DOGE is trying to fight waste, fraud, and abuse, and I think many would agree fighting waste, fraud, and abuse are good things, or modernizing the IRS IT function so that it doesn't date to before ATMs and before a man was on the moon. How would you go about that? How did you, Shalanda, think about how to address waste in programs? How would that intersect with impoundment, where if a program you found out could be done more efficiently and you don't need all of the funds, how would that work legally? And then, Wally, I'm also curious with something like IT modernization, how what kind of approach you would advocate to transitioning to a more modern IT architecture for the IRS?
So I get to this Senate-confirmed job, sit in this beautiful office.
It is beautiful. It's a very nice office.
And I told someone, I was like, I used to have real power. Now I just sit in a nice office. And I have to beg my former colleagues who've now acted like I didn't hire half of them to do something for me. As staff director of appropriation, I had to convince 3 people to do something, and it became law. No one knew my name, and it was great. And so it was just different. It was interesting sitting on 2 sides of Pennsylvania Avenue. But when you're in the executive branch, I get the frustration. The process to do these changes is to ask Congress to pass them. There are some things the executive has flexibility. Congress gives lots of flexibility to the executive branch. When we have things like avian flu that came out of nowhere, when we had a formula shortage, parents couldn't get formula for their kids, we looked around for pots of money where we had flexibility, and we used it in ways to prevent that problem from getting bigger without having to go back to Congress and waste valuable time. So there are places you have flexibility, but when you want wholesale change, that's why you have budgets. A president gets there, one of the first things they do is put together their set of proposals. It's not just money, it's policy proposals that often cost money or save money. We ask Congress plenty of times to consolidate things, to stop subsidizing certain industries. Turns out that saves lots of money when you take subsidies from industries that have been around for 30 years. When we gave them subsidies, they were novel and needed some help. And then you go make the case. You go to Congress in your budget hearings and you make the case. You get yelled at a lot because some senator is like, that helps my state. And you're like, well, it doesn't help the country or our fiscal path. And if it's the right thing to do, you take your knocks and you explain why that has to be done. That's that's how I always thought it worked. In the executive branch uses the flexibility. If Congress hates that flexibility, take it away next year. That's why you always have to be careful. But these big wholesale changes, the Clinton administration, I think, did it probably as well as any modern administration. They took probably 7 of their 8 years in reorienting the government. They reduced the size of the government, but it took most of the time they had there to do it. They worked with Congress, and it was sustainable. The real issue I'm concerned about and we have to look out for is we're going to have all these reductions, and all of these people and processes are going to be replaced by contractors that are going to cost us more money. And frankly, sign me up if one wants to look at how we spend our contract dollars and what we get out of our contract services in the government, and whether or not we can modernize faster if we can get out of some of these horrible contracts we have where only 2 people can build a system for IRS or someone else. That absolutely has to be done. But I don't think that's what we're doing here. I think we're setting up a situation where there are a few contractors who are going to make a killing out of what we're seeing happen in a few years when they're going to raise their hands like, I can fix that thing you broke last year. In 10 years from now, we're going to be like, why do we spend all this money on this contract that gives us like half of what we need? So we have to watch out for that as we come out of this, whether through the courts or through Congress finally stepping up, or we just run out of clock on their efforts to do a lot of these things. What will happen when we come out of it?
Yeah, and I think Shalonda covered a lot of the ground I would have said, but I think IT modernization in particular is really hard because sometimes it's easier to start from the beginning than to try and build on top of an old system, because we've got to still collect taxes while we're building this new system. The thing that DOGE had the potential to do was bring a bunch of talented people who know something about technology to help us think through some of these challenges at the IRS. And the way you have to do it is in what you would call a modular approach, where you do it system by system, you do it carefully, you test to make sure that nothing breaks as you're trying to implement a bunch of these changes. In order to do it, it's going to take time. And you want it to take time because you don't want to be in a position where you can't get something like your Social Security check or the IRS system doesn't work. This isn't the type of place where experimentation is going to be useful if it's not done in a way that allows you to make sure that the current system continues to function for the benefit of the American people. And I worry a lot now about systems just breaking down and making it hard for people to get the things that they need. But do we need to modernize the IRS system? Are there ways to do it that will make it more efficient and effective at both collecting revenue and making it easier for customers and the American people? Yes. How we do that has to be transparent. It needs to be an approach that gives you the ability to ensure that not a few people have the ability to do this over the next 10 years, but rather you use a lot of expertise from the private sector, but that you do it in a way that doesn't enrich certain firms. And that's possible. And I think it's what we were on the path to doing. And frankly, it was what was started in the first Trump administration in terms of some of the work that they were doing there. I think the thing that makes it the most difficult in the government setting is the annual appropriations process. That's why getting this money from Congress as part of the IRA was such a huge game changer for the IRS and put us in a position where we've made a number of modernizations to the IRS system that hadn't been made in a generation. I've got to go, but the thing I will say is that my hope is that despite a bit of the doom and gloom, many of you will consider spending some of your time in government, because I think the thing that I've discovered is that the thing that makes our government work isn't only the systems. Frankly, it's the people, and that's the hardest part to watch. Maybe you want to have a slightly smaller government and you want fewer people doing it, but the men and women who are career employees in the federal government came to do it because they love their country. They care deeply about the work that they do because they want to make sure that other Americans get the services they need. And I don't know what's going to happen over the next 3.5 years, but I do know that we're going to need good people to continue to work in government. And I hope those of you who have the privilege of getting an education here consider doing some of that with your time as well. So I'll leave the rest to the three of you. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much, Wally.
Thank you, Wally.
Now, if you want to ask me how difficult it was to work with agencies while I was at OMB, you can ask me now. I can talk about Waller.
So, I mean, building a moment off of that, Shalonda, I'm curious, the part of what Wally talked about was the quality and importance of the career civil service that has been in government. I mean, obviously at OMB, at least up until now, the vast bulk of your employees are career civil servants. Part of what DOJ seems to also be raising, and the Trump administration broadly, is the relative role of political officials versus career civil servants. How do you think about that, and the role that the civil service played at OMB, and then also looking ahead after whatever happens over the next 3 years, how would a new administration begin to think about the vast bulk of the employees in the federal government?
Look, when new administrations come in, you are like hair on fire. 4 years goes quickly. You turn around and it's like, I just got here and I got through like a third of the list and I had all these plans. And what the knee-jerk reaction does not matter. The administration is like, I need you to do this now. And good civil servants go like we're gonna sit here and talk about this. And when you sit there and talk to them about it, you're like, oh, I did not think about like that, and that. And when you really care about something, you want lasting change, you're willing to have a conversation and work through the issues that come up. So I get the reaction. It's not a new reaction the Trump administration is having. You come in for these brief moments in your life to make all these big changes and differences, and you run into people who are like, I've seen your type before, and you're about to make a mistake, and you're about to step in it. Let me help you. And you be smart to listen to them. And I found if you took the 30 minutes to sit down and have a debate, like really have a debate, and they didn't do what I wanted them to do, but I think the policy came out better because I heard them out. And by the way, they're still there. If I could convince them this was good policy, that lasts beyond Shalonda, the OMB director. That lasts for much longer than you are there. So they are the brain trust. I knew almost nothing about shipbuilding capacity. I got like 3 people at OMB who are like, we got a problem. And after they finished briefing me on shipbuilding capacity, I was like, how the hell are we gonna build all these submarines? Everyone tells me like we need to compete with China. And I'm like, we have a problem. And they've been sitting on this problem. They've been waiting on like some political to sit down and talk to them about this thing. Because like Congress is like patting itself on the back. We're patting ourselves on the back. We got all this submarine and Navy money. It's like, we don't have people to build them. We don't have the workforce. All the people who knew what they were doing retired during COVID. They were done. And we have a capacity problem. You can say build all you want. We can't. We don't have it. And that made us take 2 steps backwards and do that. They are the keepers of that information that are issues that go beyond administrations, that go beyond political problems. And sometimes politicals thinking, how do I get through today? Like if you're on the economics team in the Trump administration, like you are talking about tariffs all day, every day. What are the 1,000 things that the career teams at the National Security Council, if they still have any, and OMB are like knocking on doors like, we got a problem tomorrow, I need you to focus on. They do that, and to sideline them is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add to that, I'm really struck by the lack of institutional and knowledge that we'll face. If you think of a private business, you just can't imagine sort of disappearing all of the information and knowledge that business has, their whole knowledge management systems. You value customer lists, you value all sorts of accumulated institutional knowledge, and the mass firings and resignations, I think, are going to mean that, the people that know about the shipbuilding problem won't be there anymore.
Actually, they left before I left. I went to more retirement parties for people. They're like, I did this, I know what this is, I'm not doing this again.
Yeah, yeah. So we had some questions come in before the event, but I want to first open it up to questions of people here. So please, there are microphones on both sides if you want to chime in with a question, or I can keep going with some. Why don't I keep going while somebody brave comes to a microphone? So I wanted to understand a little bit more about impoundment, and this is not my area of expertise whatsoever, but I've been sort of struck that there has to be some discretion in the executive branch to, if suddenly, the price of raw materials going into building a ship radically declines, or you don't want government to be spending money it really doesn't need to spend. So what is the line, or what is the normal process for if in the middle of the year you figure out, actually Congress appropriated this much for this activity, and our career staff have done an extraordinary job and found out we can do it for even less?
So Congress knows that, right?
Yeah.
So they build in flexibility, which is kind of part of the legal problem now, getting the right case. They built in reprogramming authority, so they'll provide in law or transfer authority. Hey, Department of Defense, mid-year before August, you can come in with a request that moves money around between accounts. And DOD now relies on that. There is not a year they don't use this. Because think about budget cycles. Some of these numbers were developed 2 years prior to when this activity would take place. Stuff's old. So this reprogramming in the same account, or this transfer between accounts, is something most agencies have the authority to do. Now, if you abuse your authority, Congress usually takes it away as well. You also see language that says you can spend up to this amount, because maybe they agreed we should provide money to some Central America countries to look at root causes of migration, but we just don't know what that is, and we don't know who will be partners who are willing to work with us, who will be the president in one of those countries. So we're going to give maximum flexibility. You find that a lot in the bill that funds State Department and foreign operations. I think some of that flexibility is coming back to make life difficult for some of us who never imagined we'd see the mass firing and closing of some of our foreign aid agencies. So when these things go to court, a lot of flexibility is written in. They do allow in some areas to go to zero, but that was mostly because that's, things change in other countries. So it depends on how Congress provided the money. The case that David, I was able to sit in your class and hear you talk about, Train versus New York, where everyone's like, of course the courts are going to rule impoundment's illegal because they've already decided. David rightly told me, not really. The Impoundment Act wasn't even passed yet. And by the way, when I looked at the way that language was written, Congress obviously knew Nixon couldn't be trusted and were very specific in ways they usually are not. So lots of flexibility. I think Democrats now will tell you that is one of the things whenever they do a next full year spending bill, they'd like to change a lot of that flexibility. They'd like to take the no less than, the up tos, the you can deviate from this number. They'd like to take some of that away, and Republicans are like, no, we're not doing that. So that will be a big fight for the upcoming government funding fight September 30th.
And I do think that part of this will also be a question of how much does this get teed up to the courts as a question of statutory interpretation. That, to Shalanda's point, in fact, DOJ and so on, the agency heads in theory, were given the discretion by Congress versus a direct challenge to saying, we admit the statute, the Impoundment Control Act, especially layered on top of the appropriations bills, means we didn't have the flexibility under the statute, but we claim inherent executive discretion. And elements of the Trump administration have leaned into the idea that they may claim inherent executive discretion. They give a parallel to non-enforcement, enforcement discretion. If that gets cleanly teed up, a number of justices, including conservative justices, are on the record saying they would lose, but I think to Shalanda's point, there will be a question whether you have that clean tee up.
So we do have a question from the audience.
Yes, yeah, sorry, I don't know if this is on, but first of all, thank you so much for coming in. It's been a really insightful conversation. I'm currently taking LRS right now, and so it's good to get some perspectives from the inside, so to speak. My question is sort of about the balancing that you try to accomplish when you're trying to reform a system. So more specifically, during the conversation today, we've heard that there are problems with government, right? The debt is on an unsustainable trajectory. Government is maybe a little bit too big in some areas and not big enough in other areas, but the current efforts seem to be significantly eroding the brain trust that you need to actually be able to implement sustainable reform. And so my question is, when you're thinking about trying to fix things within government, how do you balance trying to uproot the things that need to be pulled out, so to speak, without doing it to a degree that prevents you from actually fixing the problem in the long run?
It's difficult. Radical change does not work well with the government, especially a government who provides services to the American people. On the way over here, one of my favorite programs is Head Start. And they haven't touched the grants going out to communities, but what they have done is close regional offices. So if you had an issue with your program and you used to calling Sharon in the Boston office, Sharon's key card did not work one morning. Like, she did not know. They got one communication, then they were frozen out of the system. Sure, after like 2 years of being there and making a couple proposals to Congress, and trying to plead your case, maybe I could have said, hey, let's consolidate these regional offices, or hey, better yet, let me build some capacity in the state offices. Maybe I can give them a little money to do technical assistance. Let's try to streamline this. You will run into roadblocks. That is a frustration when I'd say work for Congress. Congress is like, you're not closing that office in my Boston office. You get a lot of that. But really, that's the only way to do this, unless you choose this route, which I don't tell anyone to do this because I think it's illegal. And it's certainly immoral if it's not illegal to do what we're seeing done to federal workers and to families who depend on these programs that are like just slowly bleeding out. But if you're not willing to work on the slow path, like to convince Congress that it is worth trying to streamline because we need to save money, we spend too much on leases. These things are like boring and not interesting to them, but it's our job to present it in ways that's digestible and to try to get them to come along to do these reforms. Remember, it took Clinton 7 years to do some of this. What tends to happen, honestly, to make them take things like this on are some kind of fiscal cliffs. You see debt ceilings used as political tools. I'm not a favor of that because I don't think we should hold the full faith and credit of the United States, but you've seen some of these major fiscal deals in Congress and executive branch come together when they have to find agreement around things like lifting the debt ceiling or some other major crisis. Lots of people think when the Social Security Trust Fund runs out of money in 2034, that's going to be this grand time for a grand bargain on both parties coming together. I'm not sure I believe that, but you do have those opportunities in political spaces to find times to do these wholesale changes, but it brings everyone to the table, not what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I would just
No, go on.
Add to that, if we're looking sort of more granularly at specific programs, I think it can really vary. It's a lot easier in some ways to stand up something new than reform something that already exists. So I'm thinking of, for example, the last administration started Direct File, where taxpayers can start filing their taxes using IRS software. And it was a huge effort. I think a lot of why that happened was outside pressure, a long interest of many nonprofits making the case, and then internal support and leaders really championing that within the administration. And I don't want to discount that it was an extraordinary lift, but if you then think instead of how are you going to transform the entire IRS IT infrastructure that's existed for 50 years and is on COBOL into a modern system while it's operating and needs to be working well every day, that's a much harder thing, because you can't just like throw it away and start from scratch, even
Hello,
if that would be
FAFSA.
easier.
I mean,
Yeah.
FAFSA was, Congress told us to modernize it, and sorry to everyone in here who had to fill out a FAFSA in the middle of that. But I won't name the contractor, but turns out a lot of like the nuts and bolts of this were sitting in a contractor who we got to know very, very well during that process. But that was a great example of Congress saying this is broken and needs to be more simple. The Trump administration was there when that bill was passed, didn't start that process. So we got to it and were jammed, and it caused a lot of disruption.
The one thing I would add, and then we go to what may be our last question. And I imagine we all agree on this. There are parts of the government, when you look at it, you're like, man, that just should be working better. I think it's also important, like the government systems actually, and some of the key, like some of them work pretty well. They may be antiquated, maybe old, but like the Social Security Administration delivers a vast amount of benefit at extremely low cost. That system right now may be breaking for reasons potentially related to this panel, but like it is true, the IRS has a really old system. But if you wanted to get money to Americans in short order, and I'm talking in days, to people's bank accounts, they had an ability working with the career staff and so on and the federal payment system to do it. And if we've ever been on the phone with like our cable company, we know that it's not just government bureaucracies that sometimes like don't work well. So I think it was also a question of figuring out what is working, figuring out what is not working, and then actually like building on the stuff that works. And that's like a hard thing to do. But I just like, part of it is also recognizing the things that were happening correctly and that were serving a lot of people and right now may be at risk.
Thank you so much. I was just wondering, this is being portrayed as like a short-term problem, maybe 3 years, maybe 7 years, who knows? And then eventually it will go back. My question just is, when the wheels of fortune change and the Democrats go back into control, who's to say that they're not going to say like, oh, Trump just did this, we can also do this? And like, what's to ensure that like we don't become like just with an executive branch with everything else being...
Oh dear, I hope I didn't leave the impression this is fixable soon. That's one of my great worries when people ask like, how do you fix this? I was like, I don't know. Because Wally gave you an impassioned speech like, come to government. My worry is people who are like, it's one of the few places people are still willing to give like 30, 40 of their years to. And I'm not quite sure people will trust it as an institution to do that anymore. And that's really, I think, going to be really hard to repair. And, as the one bright side is they're doing this through executive action. Congress has not taken any of the money away. So the rebuilding, some of those resources will be there to do some of it. But whoever's there next will miss the opportunity to rebuild in ways, it's easier to build something new that works well than working around. So the breakage allows for something to come out of it better. This is not how any of us, I think up here you've heard, would do this. But I hope smart people are taking the time now to think through, if I had a blank slate, what would be the way to build this back in a better way? But you bring the point like I worry about all the time. And I go back to, yes, the next Democratic administration, if they have a broken Congress, they're going to have to use executive action to do things. But the danger in that is this like every 4 years, that's a problem in foreign policy. Can you imagine being our friend? That's a domestic policy. I think we're a little more used to it, but it's scary. You don't see some of the continuation, like a Danny Werfels at IRS should still be in his job. The head of CFPB should still be in his job. You don't see that continuation in just common sense policies. That doesn't get fixed unless Congress gets fixed.
Yeah, I want to emphasize first, I don't think the problems being created now are going to be fixed in 3.5 years. And one of the career officials who recently resigned from the IRS, who had been there over 50 years, I heard said this will set back tax compliance by 30 years. And part of this is because we really rely on a voluntary compliance system. Very few people are audited. It's, belief that the tax system is roughly fair and that it is working with you even if nobody likes paying their taxes. And if you think you're, in addition, your data is going to be leaked, or you can't get anybody on a phone, or it becomes very obvious that nobody is ever going to be audited in certain groups, or virtually nobody, that will really affect tax compliance long term. And then the erosion of the civil service is going to have profound effects very long. But I do think one of the things you're getting at is like, well, is there a whipsaw? And I was really interested. I hadn't heard before Wally say the statistic. I can't remember if he said 70 or 80% of the IRS modernization efforts that started under Trump with Chuck Rettig, who was his IRS commissioner, were continued. And I really think we need more of that because there are a lot of government reform projects that are not partisan. To modernize IT infrastructure is not a partisan issue, but what little I know of it, it is a long-term process. And so if everybody, once every 4 years, someone comes in and says, I want to do it a new way, you're just setting back the effort. So I do think that's something that we need to be cognizant of across administrations.
The final thing I will say is that I can only hope, but in 3 years' time, I think in the hopes of a potential change, I guess there'll be a new administration, fingers crossed in any case, there will have to be a deep discussion about what it looks like to hire in the federal government, and the fact that normally hiring is extremely hard, but in a world in which you have lost as much as you have, it will require significant hiring to begin to rebuild, even if it doesn't end up looking like what it did before.
And most of us thought that needed reform.
Yeah, it
Anyway.
needed, to be clear, that
Yeah.
needed reform anyway.
Yeah.
So with that,
Well, thank you so much,
Yes,
Shalonda.
thank you so
and
much.
thank you to our audience.